All right, and we are live. So, welcome everybody to our April, or says April. I never changed that. Whoops. It's May.
It's
Um,
May.
I use this
It can
template
be
from like
April.
class. It feels like April.
There you
Feels
go.
like April of 2020.
In, in protest of the weather, we're naming this the April Music Club.
I disagree with that. I love the weather right now. But it is May. And for May, we listened to The Low End Theory by A Tribe Called Quest. Before we get started, I do want to talk about our other clubs, which hopefully I did update the slide about those. Yeah, I did. So tonight we're talking about The Low End Theory by A Tribe Called Quest, but tomorrow night we actually have a discussion on the Grand Budapest Hotel. So tomorrow night at 7 p.m., we will be back on here to talk about that. And then our quarterly book club is Leonardo da Vinci by Walter Isaacson. I also have it here. I was actually reading it while I was waiting for everybody to get onto the call.
I got mine today at the last bookstore.
Ooh, nice.
Tim taught me the trick to parking as you go to Grand Central. What is that called?
Yeah, the Grand Central Market.
That.
Yeah.
Park there and walk over. Reasonable parking. You have a place to eat.
There's a lot of like parking spaces in between there, and they're usually like $5.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so there's like a lot of like ways to get it. Anyways.
Well, you're way more savvy than me.
We don't have a date for when we're discussing, just somewhere at the end of July. So if you want to join
500 pages.
I know, and I keep telling people, I'm like, a surprising amount of them are pictures. I mean, I say surprising. He was an artist. It makes sense that there'd be pictures in it. That and like they also have notes at the end, so like it's really more like 450 pages. Come on.
I don't know about that.
So look forward to those clubs in the future. If you are watching as we are live, you can always feel free to join our discussion by commenting. We do get those comments as we're watching this. If you are watching it on the replay, you can still comment. If you comment on Facebook, I get notifications about that. If you comment on YouTube, it will probably take me about a month to figure out that somebody wrote a comment, but I will still respond to you. And I think that's all the housekeeping kind of rules. So let me go ahead and talk about the Low End Theory. I did not write a little bio for it like I usually do, but this album was it was released in 1991 after being recorded through 1990 and 1991. What I'm reading here is correct. It seems like they actually kind of switched up their production quite a bit away through, which I think is kind of representative in a few of the songs. Some of the songs sound like they're dissing a production team. It was recorded at Battery Studios in New York City, and the primary group of people that are in it are A Tribe Called Quest, which is really just 4 people, but this album has so many people on it. And in fact, it started a lot of careers. So the people who are part of it, Q-Tip, Phife Dawg, Ali Shaheed Muhammad, and Jorobi White. And I think it's funny because like when they have the production notes, instead of writing their names, they just say A Tribe Called Quest. So the production notes are like, production by A Tribe Called Quest. But it does have like a ton of people on it. I know it started Busta Rhymes' career. I will fully admit that I know very, very little. This is not my genre of music. So it's something that I think this is across the board for us. But it's a really, really important album. It's super interesting. It's very different than what was happening at the time, and it had so much of an inspiration on a lot of things that are happening now in hip hop. So let's get into it because, like I said, I don't actually have a long written bio for this one. So I'm going to start with my usual questions. Is this an album that you guys have listened to before?
No, I've heard bits and pieces. I mean, this is a very famous album uh, from, like you said, started careers, and it was like kind of what put hip hop on the map in the early 90s. Like as far as pop culture and outside of, hip hop circles. But so I've heard like bits and pieces of it, but never like listened to it before today.
This was released when I was still working in record stores, although I wasn't working in the store, I was in the corporate office. And so I might have heard bits and pieces of it, but like people forget like back then, it's still the really early days of rap. I mean, the very first rap stuff happened in the mid 80s. So it's only 5, 6 years into it. And it didn't sell, it wasn't mainstream and it didn't sell a lot, although they sold a lot of records. They were kind of considered alternative to everything else happening in rap at that time, you know?
Mhm.
And I think their influence is bigger. The influence of the album is more in the years since then. And I learned in reading up on this that it was a huge influence on Dr. Dre and what he ended up doing in the Chronic. So, and then with stuff like the Chronic, then rap was mainstream. It was selling huge numbers, you know, and they did well. It was certified gold, which isn't, you know, the biggest thing on the planet. It's not, you know, making Michael Jackson worry about sales numbers, but it was like super influential, and I can understand why and stuff. I have 3 facts to geek out on, and I'll do one right now. This is where Questlove got his name. He named himself as a lover of Tribe Called Quest, so that's how
I,
he became Questlove.
I kind of thought that that might be the case, and then I never followed through on looking it up. So I'm glad that you confirmed that because I know
Yeah.
that he especially was heavily influenced by them. Um, so yeah, rap was, I think it was initially originates in like the late 70s,
Mhm.
but I had to go and listen to a lot of other stuff from this time frame because my knowledge of like rap and hip hop from this time frame are like it's very specific sound that this simultaneously has and doesn't have at all.
Mhm.
Um, they took a lot of inspiration from Straight Outta Compton. And that is probably one of the closest things that I could find to this. Um,
How much before was Straight Outta Compton? It was like
like
right
2
before,
it was
right?
like 2 weeks or not 2 weeks, 2 years.
Yeah, it wasn't a long, I mean, in terms of, how do you say, the history of the art form, it wasn't that long before. Yeah. But it's also very different, and it just seems less gangstery, you know, even though they're East Coast.
Uh, yeah, it's very minimal, which I think is why it's so different from everything else that happened at that time. Like, I know, Public Enemy was operating during that time.
Mhm.
Some other people, like I said, not really my genre. I don't have a lot of information there, but like it has like a very, very 80s sound to it, all the other stuff, or like things that I hear in a lot of the rap that became very, very mainstream in like the late 90s, early 2000s, where you have like Will Smith
Mhm.
and like it has that very, very like I don't know how to explain it other than the 80s, 90s sound. It's almost like maximalist, and this is minimalist,
Yeah, yeah,
um, because this is just bass, drums, and rapping with occasionally a synth on there. It's so minimal. Um,
yeah.
and I did learn through reading it that this was actually one of the first known examples of people layering drums, which, if you ever do anything in like synthesis or electronic music, that's like the standard.
Mm,
And so
yeah.
it's weird to me that this was like the first time where somebody was just like, "Oh, if we put like 2 bass drums on top of each other."
Oh, okay. You're talking about duplicating parts as opposed to having different parts on top of each other. I didn't notice that. I did notice a lot of different parts on top of each other, but yeah.
Like sounds, so like sound samples,
Sounds,
because
got it.
they use drum machines.
Did you happen to look up what the sampler technology was at that time? Were
Uh,
there like samplers that could help you in making a record by then? I don't think there were. I mean, I
I
think they
mean,
existed, but they were really kludgy.
yeah, no, not along the lines. But drum machines definitely existed. But their production for the samples it was revolutionary because they got rid of all the pops and crackles in it, and they like came up with a way of doing it.
And to me, as a drummer, all the drums sound sampled, right?
Yeah.
Meaning it sounds like a live drummer and it's looped, right? And the grooves are just exceptional. Like just really, really not only danceable, but like subtle. And then this I'm trying not to get geeky, but like there's this thing where you can play a straight beat slightly swung, which Ringo did constantly with the Beatles, and every track on here that's got a straight-ish beat is slightly swung, which is if you take it back far enough, it's a very West African thing to do, right? And all of their drums they sound amazing, and the groove, just like even without great sounds, is amazing. I was just really, really struck by that.
I will say this album has something so sorry, I have to pick up Ryan from the airport later and his plane keeps getting delayed, so I just like keep getting notifications about it. So if you see me like getting distracted and looking to the side, it's just another delay on when I have to go pick him up.
Anyways.
I'm trying to find out what drum machine they were actually using and what the sampling was because the information on it is iffy.
If you want me to riff for a bit while you look that up, I have a great Ron Carter story.
I kind of forgot what I was talking about before I got distracted by my phone,
Oh,
but I
you're talking about the
remembered.
drum machine technology or the what they used in getting the drum tracks?
No, it's more the thought that I was having before was more about how this album is like I have to when I listen to it, I have to remember that this is the first time a lot of this technology was used because a lot of it is things that I've heard a million times. And this album, like the beats on it and like the actual bass lines have been repeated so many times that like at some point the album got like a little bit boring for me. Like I zoned out a little bit because I was like, I've heard this all before, and my brain just like flipped off. In movies, this is Citizen Kane is the relation for it. Of Citizen Kane is if you try to watch it now, still a good movie, incredibly boring. Also, it's not as revolutionary as it was because that was the first time any of those techniques were used. And I think this album has that same problem for me as somebody who is not super into hip hop and only listens to it through what's in pop culture currently. Is now I'm listening to what is the basis for everything that I'm hearing now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it hits
Yeah,
not
a
as
lot
hard.
a lot of the songs do sound similar. And immediately I placed it with I don't know if you've seen Kipo and the Age of Wonder Beasts, but the Newton Wolves rap was like definitely inspired by this album.
Yeah. They have a fun thing for when I was listening to them because I was listening to it on Spotify of all of their songs end very, very abruptly. And then the next song always starts with like the same, like they're setting up their loops. And so there were multiple times where like I didn't quite catch it. And I'm like
the
wait
song
a second.
change.
Yeah.
Yeah, same. I was like, hang on, this sounds different. Is this a new song or is this just like a bridge or something?
So I think for me, it definitely falls into that category of albums that are very good and I can recognize them for their technicalness, but like I don't think I would ever listen to this as a full album again.
Yeah. And then one particular production technique that has gone like global and like now that we live in the era of everybody's doing albums on their laptop it's everybody does this. And that was that kind of, I think of it as a cinematic scene change, for lack of a better term, where all of a sudden everything in the track kind of stops. There's a new scene. It's kind of lo-fi, and it's got a different sort of audio signature. And then you go back to the regular groove. And people do that all the time now in pop music. Billie Eilish does this. Every person on the planet does that. And I'm pretty sure they were the first big act to do that. I'm not 100% sure. They're certainly the first big act to popularize it, you know? And I just love that stuff. When it gets to that, it's just like, because my thing with hip hop to this point, not that I listened to this album a lot when it came out, was that there wasn't enough. There was no hooks. They weren't into repetition of hooky lyrics or like even something like a chorus, right? And these guys got hooks all over the place. They're not afraid to use repetition. They don't use it in all the songs, but they use it plenty. And I would have, had I listened to this album a lot, I would have liked it in ways that I didn't like the early 80s stuff, because it was all just very much rapping. And it's like, I need a hook. I need like something to repeat so that, you know, because to me, it's just an onslaught of lyrics and it's great. But at some point that was kind of overload for me. But I really loved it that they had chord changes, right? And then they had repetition, they had hooks, and they had really cool samples. And the bass playing, I thought, was sampled, and that's not all true. They brought Ron Carter in and I looked up an interview with Ron Carter about his experience with this album, and I'll share that later. That's just more geekiness. But I really liked how musical it was, in a way that the rap I was familiar with kind of wasn't, you know? So I really love that in hindsight. And like, I'm like, God, this has been around since 91. I should have been listening. I really, really love that aspect of the musicality of it.
Yeah, it's definitely had a lot of inspiration on current artists. And like you're saying, not just hip hop artists, but like pop artists in general, but especially like hip hop now. And the way, you know, it has a lot of those kind of melodic progressions and things like that. You know, you can kind of trace back in the sound of this where all that comes from.
Yes, I agree.
So I found the information on the sampler.
Ah,
So it is an Ensoniq performance sampler, which I have no experience with. It is an 8 to 16 track sequencer, and you can connect it to a floppy disk drive.
ooh, a floppy disk.
Yeah.
Okay, that's reliable.
State of the art technology back then.
Oh, absolutely.
Wow.
Better than what a lot of people did, which was like just record something like onto a
Like a
voice
tape and play it
messaging.
back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of people have used voice messaging.
Oh, wow.
Like
Answering
a
machine.
answering machine.
Yeah. A lot of people
It's the
used answering
lo-fi.
machines, and then you'd record it to a different one. And
Mhm.
I don't know a lot about it, so I can't tell you much. It was made in 1988, but it is an 8 to 16 track sequencer, depending on how much memory you decide to put in it.
Mm.
And I wonder if that did have an effect on like how minimalist it was, or if that was like an active choice that they did.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting. I'm kind of leaning in the direction of active choice just because of they brought a session musician in. I'm like, who in hip hop did that? Now, the Run DMC at the beginning brought in Eddie Gonzalez when they needed heavy metal guitar, right? But that was, I just don't know that happening a lot back then. I'm not a hip hop expert, but the fact that Ron Carter was brought in and he played on multiple tracks, I think almost everything that is acoustic bass on here, he tracked as opposed to they sampled, you know?
Mhm.
But that leads me to believe it's just sort of like it's choices, but you know, who knows? But it's a great question because sometimes it's too bad we don't have it would be really good if somebody could describe the capabilities of that sequencer and what it was good at and what it was not good at, to just see, because I bet you my sense of how well this recording has held up over, are we at 30 years? Over
Yeah.
30 years, right? Is because they were just really got the most out of it. Like most people working with that piece of gear would not have come up with this album, is my sense of it, but I'm not an expert.
Also, the fact that they called it the low end theory and featured the bass on it very, very heavily, it does make me feel like that was like a very conscious choice that they would have made. It also gives them a better soapbox for like their actual like verses, which are filled with meaning and just feels like they just got up and were able to just write a little speech.
Mhm.
Definitely a lot of critique of the music industry.
Which is why I think it's interesting that I know that they did like switch productions halfway through.
Did they switch labels
I
or just
think they
production teams?
I think they switched labels.
Yeah, oftentimes that'll happen. You
Yeah.
get moved to a different label. You have to work with their producers. Back then, at least.
So while they were recording it, the group fired their manager, and they
Oh,
joined a
that'll do it.
different artist management.
Wow.
They also fired their lawyer, and created tension with the Native Tongues Collective, which was never fully resolved. The Native Tongues being a collective in the late 80s, early 90s of hip hop artists that were known for their positive-minded, good-natured, Afrocentric lyrics.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, the other
Yeah.
thing I wanted to say, I love how this is playful. Like this album, you know, it just sounds like there's I'm not saying it has a light message or it's light in terms of content, but a lot of it just sounds really playful and joyful. And I think that really comes through. And again, man, I'm not thinking of a whole lot of, I mean, the Beastie Boys were partying, but it didn't necessarily always sound playful, like to the degree that this is, right? But I just love that aspect of it. It's just sort of this creative sense of play and just mucking around.
I actually think I disagree with you on that. Not that this doesn't sound playful. I mean, at times it gets very, very serious. I mean, there's an entire song about date rape, but I think a lot of things from that time frame are playful, especially within like the hip hop genre. I mean, I just said that there was an entire collective who were hip hop artists who prided themselves on putting forth like positive vibes.
Mhm.
And I think you have like a huge difference in that time frame between like people who were like doing like the gangster rap and then
Right.
like people doing this kind of thing where it was kind of just like they had an idea and then they would each get up and like say their piece about that idea, and ultimately they're humans who are generally good people, so their ideas that they're putting forth about this are usually kind of hopeful or have the
Yeah.
message of them as a person.
Yeah.
And
I
it's
feel
not
like
them.
I feel like there were definitely a lot of messages within the lyrics that you kind of had to be in the know to really know what they were talking about. Like I remember them mentioning something about rappers who talk about like Pan-Africanism or I don't know, something like that. And I was like, oh, I guess, that's an inside thing. Like you got kind of have to know.
Yeah, it's definitely an album that we're a little bit out of our depth on.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was raised by a Christian white woman in the suburbs. Rap was not my thing
Yeah.
in this time frame.
I'm
And-
from Europe.
And so Rebecca, so one thing I can speak to with this is the pervasiveness of gangster rap and like and part of it was the record company the record chain I was in was based in LA, so all of we basically you had the record buyers who did R&B were also the buyers for rap, and NWA was a huge thing, and Snoop Dogg before he was selling a lot was a huge thing to everybody. And I can say that this to me has a totally different vibe. And I think that's intentional, and maybe that's what I'm reacting to. So it's not anti-gangster rap, it's just an alternative to, I think. And but within the industry, like gangster rap was the thing, but that was controversial because gangster rap was really not mainstream for the late 80s.
It kind of just feels like people going two different directions with it. Like they're just,
Mm,
like it's starting to get a hold on like mainstream society, and I feel like you have the part of people who like relate to being like they want to put forward that gangsta persona,
hmm.
and then I think you have the people that are just like going back to their roots and using this. Um, were you guys able to like listen to the lyrics, or I listened to it like with the lyrics like on the
Hmm.
screen.
As I was,
No, I did
because I
not.
listened through twice because the first time I didn't really catch much of what they were saying, simply because I like to multitask while I listen to things. So I played it again and I tried to like pay closer attention and like I picked up on stuff here and there, but yeah, I don't think I really soaked in the content of the lyrics.
It does feel like it's very much like now it's your turn to talk about this thing that we're talking about, and a lot of it does feel like it's them kind of venting about like they're dealing with the industry.
Mm,
But I have a very good friend of mine who does a lot of freestyle rap. And I think that a lot of the lyrics that I hear in this, it feels like halfway freestyling, like they are trying to like show off their wordplay skills.
Hmm.
And
There
I
were
think that's
definitely,
probably where the funness of it comes from, is it's
yeah,
them just like
oh yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah.
experimenting. Yeah, there were definitely a couple of songs where you could kind of tell that they were freestyling at the end and they were just kind of seeing how long they could go.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it was fun to listen to. Hearing the inspirations in other artists now taken from this and kind of going back because, this being a very, very influential kind of early rap and hip hop scene album, like you hear it talked about a lot. And yeah, like I said, that wasn't really my scene back then. So I don't know, I used to have some very biased ideas about rap. And only now, later in my life, have I, started actually enjoying rap and hip hop. Um, but like, if I had heard this back then, I may have had a different idea.
Yeah.
But it just
it,
wasn't something that I was exposed to in my little white Christian suburb that I grew up in.
I think it's something that is new for the mainstream and was, yeah, like Miguel was talking about, this was not popular like on the wider sense.
It is
Yeah.
now.
It is now.
It absolutely is now, but they just didn't sell. I mean, if you look at whatever the top 3 selling records were in '91, that's before Nirvana, but they were selling nothing like Nirvana sold, you know what I mean?
Nirvana was its own little starting point for a lot of things.
Mhm.
But
I
they
think
shipped
we've talked about Nirvana before.
a ton of records. Nirvana sold a ton of records on the Nevermind album. It was a lot,
Yeah.
like Michael Jackson numbers.
Um,
Hey, I did
did
wanna talk about the jazz influence.
Absolutely.
So I was surprised. I've kinda gotten used to people, like, melding hip hop and jazz and didn't realize this was kind of the beginning of that. And, one of the things I learned, so when I lived in Portland, I taught West African drumming to 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. And it's funny because it was a mandatory class, so I thought it was the coolest drumming in the world, and then you had 8th grade girls that were just there going, "Ugh, I hate this class." It's because it was mandatory. Anyway, um, and, like, people friends of mine back then, and probably to this day, because, I got a lot of old coot buddies, um, say, "Well, that's not music, right? Rap's not music, ba ba da ba da ba da," right? But if you listen to West African traditional music, the elements are the same. It's mostly drums, right? So mostly beats. And the vocalizing is not melodic, it's sort of more chanting. And it's a ton of bragging, right? Whatever language you're singing in, French or one of the native tongues. They're bragging, right? And so what music that you know of has tons of beats, they're kind of chanting more than singing, and they're bragging all the time. Well, it's just hip hop. And then it's exponentially increased. When you look at West African dance, it is like hip hop dancing. It's like, so like hip hop is music before we think of popular music. And I honestly don't know how far the music forms that we think of as traditional West African forms, how far back they go, whether it's hundreds or thousands of years. But it's very closely related to that, as is jazz music. Like every popular music that came out of the United States in the 20th century, you know, jazz, rock, pop, blues, certainly R&B, country. I mean, country is the melding of Scots-Irish string music and blues, right? Country musicians kind of like to conveniently forget that. But anyway, so I thought it was sort of rap connecting with jazz. It was sort of connecting it all back to West Africa. And then I bet you this would have been, hip hop scene is obviously very big in Africa, like everywhere on the planet. But I bet you this album would have played better than most rap in West Africa, just because of the nature of the beats and the grooves, and bringing in those really interesting jazz elements. But anyway,
I think I would bring
I
it back
love
to
that.
like almost the minimalism of it, of yeah, like when I listen to other albums of this genre from that time frame, it's very maximalist and it's very, very overshadowed. But the beats are still kind of there. It's just they are buried under a lot of other things.
Yeah, there's a lot of
But
other things going on.
it's actually surprising to me that this was one of the first times that jazz and like hip hop got mixed, because you're right, they have the same origin.
Yeah,
Hmm.
And so
I
the fact
think
that
it
this is the
is, because
first,
I never heard of it. NWA sure as hell wasn't doing it. Beastie Boys weren't doing it. Run DMC wasn't.
yeah, they are credited. I always say like one of the first times, because unless I am absolutely positive that it is the first time, I don't.
Well, and
But
it kind of
yeah,
doesn't matter. It's the first ones who had an influence on the culture that made
yes.
everybody else go, "Oh, we can do this." And then what was the sort of subgenre that Blue Note signed? Like Blue Note, the ultimate jazz label, had jazz artists or had hip hop artists, and it had a subgenre name. What was the name of that? It was something like trip hop. It wasn't that.
I mean, trip hop
Anyway,
is a thing. So is
but
like,
it's a different thing than what I'm thinking of. But there was
yeah.
a sub. Oh, and I want really quickly the Ron Carter thing. So it was funny. So when Ron Carter got called for the sessions, right? And so Ron Carter, for those of you that don't know, he's a jazz bass player. He played in Miles Davis 1960s quartet. He's a kind of a legendary guy, and he's got a very unique sound. So anyway, he gets called for the section, and only thing he knows about hip hop is all the cussing in the lyrics. And he's like, I'm not gonna go. Right. So he talks to his son, who knows hip hop, and his son says, "Well, these guys are actually really musical. You should go and just check it out and see if you want to play." So he goes to the session, and one of the first things he does is he has to see the lyric sheet, right? And then he's kind of pleasantly surprised. It's not as bad as he had feared. And and then the sessions happen, everything's good, they're happy, he leaves, and the last thing he says before he goes is say, wait, don't change the words after you showed me this. Promise me you're not going to change the words, right? He was just like really like, I don't want to be on something that's full of cussing and stuff. I thought that was funny. He liked the outcome, and he's, you know, his work on that album really influenced the Chronic as well. But he went in there very kind of warily, like, oh, there's going to be all this cursing and stuff, and I don't think I want to be part of that.
Hard bop.
Yeah,
Hard bop is the subgenre from the Blue Note.
but hard bop was like Art Blakey. I'm thinking of what the hip hop thing was called.
That is the one that shows up.
Yeah, but that's like late 50s, early 60s, like Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers.
Yeah.
Hard bop. And it might have just been, I don't think it was big within hip hop. I just thought it was amazing that Blue Note had a hip hop artist, and then for some reason in my head, there was a name for it, but I might be just thinking of there was the album or the name of the artist that I might be fixated on. Anyway. But I love all those jazz elements because to me that makes it super musical. And I just like, and this is something, and when I was doing a search on YouTube, there's instrumental tracks of this album. I mean, which up until that point, there was no hip hop albums. You wanted to listen to the instrumental tracks. There's just this fucking way. There's nothing there. Right. And I could see myself listening to this. It might get repetitive in some tracks, but a lot of them would be, this is plenty for the ear.
Yeah, I was wondering while I was listening if that was something that was different as opposed to like, you know, introducing that element of mixing in jazz, which they made a real point of doing and pointing it out in the song lyrics.
They gave a shout out to Ron Carter, didn't they? There was a shout out to Ron Carter in the lyrics, wasn't there? They gave a shout out to some jazz guy.
Yeah,
I think no, it wasn't. It was a saxophone player, like somebody like Sonny Rollins, but not Sonny Rollins. You're right.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there were samples, but they weren't used like this. It's just a super musical use of samples.
I can't find out how they actually did their samples. All I know is that there was no software and no actual equipment that they could use. And so they like went through a long process of trying to get all the samples as clean as possible. But for some reason, I can't find anything on it.
Yeah, it sounded very like like streamlined.
Oh, like engineering wise, it's phenomenal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is it holds up to this day in ways that a lot of albums don't.
Yeah. Yeah. And the guys, so Q-Tip is kind of one of the lead rappers, and he's the guy who was most involved in the production and mixing. And he I told Rebecca, or maybe I just sent in the Facebook Messenger that I was listening to the Questlove Supreme with Q-Tip, right? Yeah. And Quest, the first question out of his mouth is he could never identify a particular sample on a particular track. And he was asking Q-Tip, and Q-Tip had forgotten, but he could remember, oh, it was an ECM album, and it was probably Steve Swallow, the bass player. It's like, okay, that guy listens to a lot of music. You're not going to be able to drop ECM and Steve Swallow and remember it years later when you can't remember the name of the song the sample came from. So these guys were very well, they listened to a lot more music than hip hop, right?
Yeah. I think it's interesting what you said before about like people's recognition of rap music is just like constant cussing. Because I was like, man,
that was part of why I wasn't allowed to listen to it.
That didn't start until later. I mean, there was, because there's an entire part of like of rap music, but like from this time frame, like people were getting very into the positive vibes, and there wasn't a lot of, even on this album, there's like a few explicit tracks, but not that many.
I think that started happening with Public Enemy and NWA, Gangster Rap. Yeah. Because like Beastie Boys, they were annoying, but they weren't cussing that much. Run DMC, they were very street, but they weren't cussing that much either. And artists at that point probably didn't think you could get away with it.
I think that's probably what it is, because yeah, a lot of things that I look up from that time frame, like there's fewer parental advisories than you'd expect. So I don't know when that quite became the idea, but like,
well, we know that popular American culture has lots of history with demonizing, you know, quote unquote black culture, even though black culture is where all of our culture comes from. Like it has roots in all forms of music that have been popularized over the last 2 or more centuries,
because their beats are interesting.
Because because it's more interesting than your like European classical, you know, like you can actually dance to it. So like
I have a
jazz,
lot of
rock and roll, hip hop, like everything.
I have a lot of really fun anecdotes about classical music and how like a lot of them tried to like go back down to folk music, and like the reasons for that, because they were getting so bored with it. And all the methods for and like the 20th century or the start of it. Anyways, even Public Enemy's like albums in the 80s, there are like explicit tracks, but because I'm on Spotify and it shows me like which ones are explicit, less than you'd think.
Yeah, it was done for effect, like, it would
Hmm.
happen, and so Chuck D, I think of as a really judicious use of those words. If he was gonna use a word like that, he probably knew he was gonna get in trouble from the label, and so he just saved it for real choice spots. It wasn't used like a comma, you know?
Yeah.
It wasn't like, a Richard Pryor, comedy routine, and then after that, that switched.
Yeah, and then you get to Apocalypse 91 by Public Enemy, and like it's more than half, and then by 1998 it's like the entire album. So now I'm interested in like what the history of like that kind of downhill. It was just like something that I noticed of like actually when I was like looking into stuff from this time frame, I found less explicit things, and you're right, it was like used as a punctuation mark more
And
so
back
than
then,
anything else.
politically, Al Gore's I first heard of Al Gore from his wife, Tipper Gore, who was leading this crusade against all kinds of profanity in music, right? And not just people cussing, but like, Frank Zappa and all this stuff. And I think that was a big fear in the record industry of pissing off those people, because if you had to put that, they thought you had to put that sticker on your album, that album wouldn't sell anymore, but you put that sticker on a rap album and it sold tons more. And so what you see changing between the beginning of the 90s and the end of the 90s is that shit sells. And so, Tipper Gore, yeah, we're slightly concerned, but we're way more concerned with shifting a lot of albums. And so if we can put a sticker on there and it shifts more albums,
Well, and
we're all
oddly enough, it probably had the opposite effect than what she wanted. Like,
absolutely.
bringing
Well,
attention,
in
putting a
terms of hip
spotlight on
hop,
these things and making them, people may not have been exposed to them otherwise, and then they're going, "Oh, maybe I should check that out. That sounds
yeah.
interesting."
But in terms of hip hop, in terms of mainstream, Michael Jackson sure as hell wasn't doing that stuff. Madonna was certainly not doing that stuff, right? So if you wanted to sell those kinds of units, you had to not. But there, yeah, within hip hop, that just became part of the price of entry. Or
I think that it's probably just continued as like almost a way to gatekeep hip hop music in a way, and at least modern society, so that it's because it is
gatekeeping.
um, like people are less likely because like we were talking about like hip hop has like a basis and like a lot of like jazz and a lot of like African styles that were brought over during like the slave trade and all of that has like such an influence on all music that we now hear nowadays. And even after this, like you constantly hear it in uh, everyday mainstream music. But
Mhm,
by
mhm.
keeping things very explicit and by keeping that idea up, you're like making it less likely that people are going to copy that style of music.
Hmm, interesting.
Um,
And and there's other analogs in music history. I'll be really quick with this, but the appeal of the Beatles was that they were covering Little Richard without sanitizing Little Richard. And if you listen to their live albums back then, or their live recordings back then, when the screaming reached a fever pitch is when John and George were imitating Little Richard and would just do one of that high falsetto woo thing, right? And that was a big taboo thing. Like, your parents wouldn't let you have Chuck Berry or Little Richard albums in your house, but you could have Pat Boone doing the whitewashed, uh, smoothed out version. And even Elvis kind of smoothed off the edges. He became very, very smooth after his initial sort of really interesting period. And I learned this oddly enough from Brian Eno, who grew up in some small town that had an Air Force base with lots of Americans, and that he had sort of identified that that was what the Beatles were doing. Like, and they didn't. I forget who. Pat Boone didn't have records in Britain, but there were guys in Britain basically doing the same thing. They do the watered down version of Little Richard. And so Brian had said in an interview somewhere that was the genius of the Beatles, is that they stopped watering it down and white culture just went ape shit.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of the 60s version of what happened in the 90s with rap. And yeah.
The history of music is interesting and so tied to just like culture and also for some reason politics.
Yes.
And it's
Well,
not
and
really talked about enough.
especially when we talk about like whitewashing like African style music or African American music, like jazz and rock and roll and hip hop and things like that. Like, it's an unfortunate fact of history that it took artists like the Beatles to bring that style of music mainstream. Like, it shouldn't have, but it did, just because of societal attitudes that were filled with prejudice based on nothing.
Yeah, I'm not going to, because I am a classical musician and all of my music history is based in classical. This happens all the time there too. Let me
Yeah, I'm
tell you
sure.
about the history of the hurdy-gurdy.
I mean, it's happened with all of music throughout history.
It's the people at the top want to feel like they have something new, but then they want new things and they have to steal it from other people constantly, and it's just like this constant influx. And it is very unfortunate that like it took like people like Elvis to make it come more to the forefront. Like you have to water it down. And this is something that happens a lot in music anyways, of
sanitize it for the masses, but sanitize it in a white way.
Yeah. Well, initially he was kind of doing it straight. When you're listening to the stuff that he did on Sun Records before he went to RCA, a lot of that stuff, he wasn't really watering it down because he, didn't know enough, right? It was later when he sort of really smoothed things out. But that created the space for somebody like the Beatles to come in. It was just a really dry period. The top of the charts was, she had a yellow polka dot bikini kind of songs, right? Which is just like, that's why, having a context, I wish I had a better cultural context for what was going on in hip hop when this album came out. But like, the Beatles, you listen to their first 3 albums now and it just sounds so kind of twee. And it's like, no, man, you have to contextualize it. And what else? Listen to everything else that's on the charts at the time. They're radical, but
yeah. I think it takes, I mean, when I say masses for at least the American and like the people who are holding down the fort, it's all white people.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
It takes like, you can't jump so far in. It's very rare. Like, I recently watched the Elvis movie that came out like last year. It wasn't great, but it did make me read a lot about it, which is why I brought it up now. But he just kind of grew up around it and then had to like whitewash it down later because he grew up in that environment. But for most people, like you need it to be like one quick hop over from what you're already used to. Which is why it takes so long. If like you just went from like listening to classical music and then you gave someone the low end theory, it doesn't matter that like musically speaking, it's a great album.
Are standing by.
Let's go back in time and have Beethoven listen to it and see what he says.
Yeah.
And classical music is hilarious. Apparently we're having a music history and this is where my knowledge is. The amount of times that composers were just like, boy, I came up with a fantastic idea. I am going to put a dissonant chord in here, and it started a riot. Is hilarious.
Like even early 20th century, right? With Stravinsky's Rite of Spring.
Probably earlier than that with like Salome. I remember reading about Salome was like a whole thing because not only is it a very dissonant like opera, it's also about like a woman seducing somebody and then cutting off their head. And boy, oh boy, did people hate it. Yeah, Stravinsky was actually well down the road of people like being like, I'm going to try something new theory-wise, and just everybody hating it. And now they're like all renowned, and we're like, wow, listen to this. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, well, look at artists that were revolutionary for their time in all genres. That happens every time. Like,
Yep.
you have people, like freaking Monet, who's like world renowned at this point, but in his day, he died penniless.
Oh, most of them
Mhm.
did.
Yeah.
Is there a name for that? Because that's one of the subtexts of the Ringo book. Is why have people been dissing him his entire life? But is there a name for that in art history, like the sort of negative backlash
It
of
feels like
things?
something there probably is. I don't know what it is or if it
It's
actually
very,
exists.
yeah, it's very, very interesting. And even on the level of artists who grow album to album, there's a great quote from Elvis Costello on that Ron Howard live Beatles documentary, where he talks about when I don't know which was first, Rubber Soul or the two albums right before Sgt. Pepper. Let's say it's Rubber Soul. I always conflate those two albums. He like hated that album for the first 4 weeks, and then by week 6, he couldn't live without it just because it was so different than what he was doing, right? And so even when you love something, if they're kind of stretching you in ways that you're not comfortable with, it could be a really hard row to hoe.
So here's a list of some artists that only became, we're like really far off topic from like talking about the low
Oh,
end theory, but some artists who only became revolutionary for like specific art styles after their death, starting with Bach.
yep.
Yeah. Eva Cassidy.
Say who again? Who?
Eva Cassidy.
Oh, I'm not familiar. Cool.
She's
Yeah.
like folk music.
Oh,
Hmm.
awesome.
Nick Drake,
Oh, yeah.
Jeff Buckley.
Hmm.
Um, those are the only people
Although,
on this list that I know.
did he die before Grace came out? Because Grace was a big deal, but it might have been that it was a big deal immediately after he died.
It met critical acclaim, but was not popular amongst the masses until after his passing.
Okay, that makes sense.
And I think it probably has something to do with their deaths. Like you hear about somebody dying and you immediately like go look up why we're talking about it, sort of
Yeah, well,
deal.
that's a whole phenomenon. Is like
Yeah.
artist's work is notoriously goes up in value after they pass away.
So it takes a lot of time for like things to get filtered down to like where you've been surrounded by it so much that you can start actually enjoying it. And like
Yeah.
it's something that's manufactured today, so you don't even realize it's happening. That's the whole deal with like the compression wars.
Yeah. Hey,
Um,
so going back to Tribe Called Quest, so
yeah.
this album was hugely influential. Did they start selling more records afterwards? Does anybody have any sense of that? Were they more popular in the albums after this?
I can look it up.
Yeah, because I'm thinking of Stevie Wonder. Like, I think his best work was in the '70s, and I was just reminded that he was more critically acclaimed than selling tons of records. Although he sold a lot of records in the '70s, he really sold a ton of records in the '80s. But that was in music that I don't think is up to the standard of the stuff in the '70s, you know. And so a lot of times that success lags behind your best work. And I wonder if it happened with, I'm not saying this is their best work, but it was certainly probably amongst their most influential stuff.
Oh, yeah, I think it's definitely is their most influential. So I haven't looked up their discography or like the actual sales, but I can say that there is a list of awards and nominations for them on their Wikipedia page, and the earliest one is 1994. So
Mhm.
think it's safe to say that this probably
Yeah.
they probably got a lot more success after this album.
Yeah. This was under the radar. And, it's sort of like, what was that Andy Warhol band? The Velvet Underground. Like, nobody bought their records, but everybody who bought their records started their own band, so.
They absolutely, looking at the way that their charts worked, they were absolutely more popular after this album, but I feel like that might be more attributed to just rap music becoming more popular in general. And probably a lot of it had to do with like Public Enemy like really coming onto the scene with full force, like a lot of like the culture getting put into the mainstream and then people relating it back to this album.
Yeah.
But it seems like they released 4 albums after this, and all of them are like in the single digits on the charts,
Yeah.
whereas the
Yeah.
Low End Theory like topped the US R&B charts at 13.
Okay. And the key word there is R&B. There wasn't even a rap chart, right?
Yes.
So
Well, I
you're
think it's
competing
R&B
against
hip
Michael
hop.
Jackson. Oh, it was R&B hip hop
Yeah,
slash.
because
You're
like
still competing with Michael Jackson.
when I think about like radio stations, it's usually like R&B, hip hop, rap all
Absolutely.
together.
Yeah.
For just the standard charts, the Low End Theory topped at 45.
Yeah. But that's like everything like the pop chart. Yeah.
Yeah, everything, whereas their other albums like uh peaked in the single digits, so
Yeah.
Hmm.
But it was
including
really interesting to learn it was a big influence on Chronic. And I remember Chronic being the first rap album that shifted a ton of units, but also was critically acclaimed. Like the Beastie Boys sold a lot of records, but everybody hated them. They were just kind of annoying. They got better later, like with Paul's Boutique. But I just remember the Chronic being like, and Chronic is mid 90s, right? Not or late 90s?
late 90s, I think.
Is it late 90s? Yeah. But that's when all in terms of the industry support for rap and hip hop, that was like helped by the fact that the industry was ready to shift tons of units for something like that where they weren't in the beginning of the 90s. And the culture, the wider culture too.
Um,
Are we coming up on time? I just want
we
to
are.
you don't get surprised.
We are coming up on
We
time.
are, in fact. I am sorry, I'm distracted. I am trying to find out a little bit about the cover art because it's very iconic.
I'm assuming it's a painted woman. I don't know if any artist can paint that well, but it's a painted individual shot with 3D fluorescent paint. I'm assuming with like
I don't know. I can't
additional
find anything on
drawing.
its production. Just that it.
There's an artist credited on the wiki page for the album, but it's not anybody I'd heard of, and it sounded like a hip hop name. It sounds like it's not the real name anyway. But
Let's find out.
and let me tell you, this is like the kind of album cover that, in a record store, and this was coming out when CDs were big, but LPs also mattered too. You could see that thing from across the record store. Record stores still mattered, right? And it's just like a stunningly good. It looks really cool, but like in a record store that would pop. If that album, the LP size version of that was on an end cap at Amoeba, you would like go, what's that? Oh, okay.
Mhm. Yeah,
Great
in 2011, it was named the best hip hop and rap album cover of all time.
It's a
Yeah,
great
it
album
should.
cover.
It is. Does it say who the artist was?
I mean, I think it was designed by a what do you call it? Like a collaborative agency of
Oh,
artists.
like somebody from the
It's
label. Yeah.
it says that it's an altered photograph is
Okay.
how it's
Makes sense.
described, but that is about as much information as I can find.
Hmm.
My favorite part is there's paint on the bottoms of her feet, if that's how they did the photograph.
Gene Kelly, Zombart, JK.
Yeah, you're right. There is on the bottom of the feet.
But it is a great, great album cover. That thing pops.
Yeah, it's not something that's usually in my wheelhouse. I really, really enjoyed listening to it. But like I said, I think I preferred it before when I was just hearing it in bits and pieces, because after a while it does become like a little bit too much.
I did
and the
find
repetition.
the later songs are more different. Like the first few songs on the album are definitely like, oh, is this a continuation of the same song?
Yes.
But the later ones are a little bit more differentiated.
And I have kind of the opposite reaction thinking about being made to listen to hip hop albums before this, where there wasn't the amount of musicality and there wasn't like enough sort of, lack of a better term, audio interesting things happening in most rap albums, I could listen to this a lot. I'm also not a lyric guy. So, but I just thought musically it's just super interesting, and I could listen to some of that stuff for forever. Plus, it's great drum tracks, so I'm biased. I could listen to great drum tracks by themselves forever, and I do, but that's me.
Unless anybody,
I did want to say that it's great. I felt guilty coming to this because what the heck do I know about hip hop? But you know, when you think about those reaction videos that you see all over YouTube, man, it's much more interesting listening to hip hop dudes listen to Led Zeppelin for the first time and react than it is to hear some 60-year-old guy like me talking about when I first heard Led Zeppelin. I mean, like, who freaking cares, right? And so I think, you know, people who are hip hop aficionados listen to this are going to get something out of the fact that none of these people grew up with it, right? And hopefully we would say stuff about it that, you know, Questlove wouldn't say.
We definitely
That's my
come
story,
at it from
I'm sticking to it.
We definitely come at it from a different perspective. So
Yeah.
I think all we can do is like listen to it and acknowledge it as a piece of art that we had no exposure to when we were younger. And I think that in and of itself is fantastic.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you for picking this, Rebecca.
Yeah.
What have you picked the next one? The next album?
I
No?
will be completely honest, I have not.
But in the meantime, everyone go listen to this album.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Check it out.
And I will post the next picks on Wednesday. So I have until Wednesday to figure out where we're going from here. But I look forward to listening to it and discussing it with you guys.
All right.
Likewise.
All right.
Bye, Internet.
Bye.